Erev Tov, everyone. So last couple of nights we've been talking about Hilchot Mezuzah. We got onto that topic from the parsha because we had the midrash at the beginning of the parsha. Vayikach Korach. We saw Rashi told us Korach came with the talit, which was kulot tchelet, and he said if you have an entire beged, it's tchelet, you still need the tzitzit. And then he said if you have a bait malei sfarim, you have a whole house which is filled with sifrei kodesh, you still need the apartment of the mezuzah. The answer to both questions, of course, is yeah. Based on that, we went on a bit of a journey talking about different questions that come up in Hilchot Mezuzah. And somebody asked me yesterday, now how am I going to tie it all back to the parsha at the end? The answer is I'm not. I'm not even going to pretend. So you can forget about that. But let's carry on talking another Dvar Halacha. Since we were discussing the idea of the brachot, when you take down the mezuzah, put it back up, right? Did you say new bracha or not? We mentioned the idea of tefillin. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the brachot that we say in tefillin in the morning. It's very interesting because, as you know, we have two brachot of tefillin. We have the bracha of laniach tefillin on the tefillin shel yad, and then the bracha of al mitzvah tefillin on the tefillin shel rosh. And according to the Ashkenazi custom, in any ways, we'll see. Not everybody agrees with this, and it's a bit of a strange thing when you think about it. For two parts of a mitzvah, that's part of the question. Is there one mitzvah here? Is there two separate mitzvahs? Shel yad, shel rosh. But generally speaking, even when you have a mitzvah which has multiple parts, we usually only say one bracha on the Gemara mitzvah. We don't necessarily say a separate bracha on each part. So it's a little bit strange that we would say, and many poskim are opposed to it, that we would say one bracha on the shel yad and then another bracha on the shel rosh. So let's try and unpack it in a few minutes that we have. So we have the sugyas in the Gemara in Menachot, Daf Lamed Vav, and the Gemara says like this. It says, Amar Rav Chisda, Tzach ben tefillah letefillah, where tefillah here is referring to tefillin. Right? So he says, Tzach ben tefillah letefillah, you speak. You have an interruption between the tefillin shel yad and the tefillin shel rosh, which you're not supposed to do. And then he says, Chozer u'mevarech. See, again, it's not so clear. That word, Chozer u'mevarech, the different girsaot, some include the word Chozer, some don't include the word Chozer. But he says, if you speak and you have an interruption between your tefillin shel yad and your tefillin shel rosh, you have to go back and say the bracha again. So the simple understanding at this point would seem to be that there's one bracha, you say the bracha at the beginning, when you start putting on the tefillin shel yad. However, person spoke, person interrupted, they hadn't yet finished the mitzvah, so you need to go back and the bracha now doesn't apply because there's been a hefsek, you need to go back and say it again. So then it says the Gemara, sach in lo sach lo. Says, wait a minute, you're saying that you only say the bracha on tefillin shel rosh if you spoke in between. But if not. He says the following. He says, Al tefillah shel yad omer, Baruch asher kidshanu mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'aniach tefillin, and al tefillin shel rosh omer, Baruch asher kidshanu mitzvotav v'tzivanu al mitzvat tefillin. In other words, there's two separate brachot. You said chozer mevarech. That in itself, the language of chozer mevarech seems to imply you go back and you say the same bracha. Could say maybe you go back and say bracha again, but the simple shot would be go back and say the same bracha. And here he's saying it's a separate bracha. You have one bracha for the shel yad, you have one bracha for the shel rosh. So then concludes the Gemara here, a very short sugya. It says Abaye v'Rava dami tarvayu. They both said Abaye and Rava lo sach mevarech achat, sach mevarech shtayim. So if you did not speak, you did not interrupt between the shel yad and shel rosh, you say one bracha. You did speak, you didn't interrupt, then you say two brachot. In other words, so how does Rashi learns that when you say, it says, the fact that you have a second bracha, the bracha of the shel rosh, that is only b'di'evet, meaning lechatchila, you're only meant to say one bracha when you put on tefillin, that is laniach tefillin, and that is what it means when the Gemara says, lo sach, you didn't speak, you didn't interrupt, mevarech achat, you only say one bracha altogether. However, sach mevarech shtayim. But if you do speak, you do interrupt, then you need to say two brachot, one on the shel yad and one on the shel rosh. They're different brachot. The great difficulty with Rashi's interpretation is the fact that the Gemara started and said, chozer mevarech. You go back and you say the bracha again. We're saying you don't say the bracha again, you say a different bracha. So therefore you would have to say, the Gemara says, I didn't have a chance to look inside at the different girsaot, different kitvei yad of the Gemara. But the Gemara says that clearly there were two different girsaot, and the girsa of Rashi does not have the word chozer, because otherwise it doesn't seem to make sense. So Tosfot, Rabbeinu Tam, learns the entire thing differently. And whereby Choser U'Mevarech, in that sense, makes more sense. He understands that Choser U'Mevarech refers to you go back and you say the same bracha again. Okay. So what about the fact that the Gemara says that there are two different brachot? He understands the last line as follows: Lo tzach mevarech achat, tzach mevarech shtan. If you didn't speak, you say one bracha. If you did speak, you say two brachot. That's relating to the tefillin shel Rosh, not relating to how many brachot you make in total. Meaning, according to Rabbeinu Tam, you always say a bracha on the tefillin shel Rosh. But if you did things properly and you didn't speak, you didn't interrupt in the first place. So on your shal yad you say laniach tefillin, and on your shal Rosh you say al mitzvah tefillin. That is mevarech achat. You've only said one bracha on the shal Rosh. But if you spoke in between, so you said your first bracha of laniach tefillin does not apply anymore for the shal Rosh. So now for the shal Rosh you have to say two brachot. And in total you would say three. That's the machloket. That's the two ways to understand the Gemara. In other words, according to when the Gemara says you go back, if you speak in between shal Rosh and shal yad and shal Rosh, Choser U'Mevarech, go back and say a bracha again. According to Rashi, if you didn't speak, you wouldn't say any bracha. You only said the bracha on shal yad, and that's it. If you spoke, you would have to add in the second bracha on the shal Rosh. According to Rabbeinu Tam, you're always going to say the second bracha on the shal Rosh. The question is, if you spoke, are you then going to repeat and you're actually going to say a third bracha on your tefillin in total? That is the difference of opinion, Rashi and Rabbeinu Tam. The Gra, we'll come back to the Gra because we need to get to the Shulchan Aruch, it was chronologically earlier. But the Vilna Gaon says he accepts the interpretation of Rashi. In other words, again, with a different gesalt, but he says, therefore, he's very strongly that you should only say the one bracha where you haven't spoken. Now, Shulchan Aruch over here, Siman Kaf Hey, in Hilchot Tefillin, fairly long if Hey, he talks about the different kavanah we should have and the bracha that we should say on the Tefillin. He says, Yechaven be'anachatam. Important to know, what should a person have in mind when they put on the Tefillin? Shetzivanu HaKadosh Baruch Hu laniach arba parshiyot elu. That HaKadosh Baruch Hu commanded us to take these 4 parshiyot and to put them in our tefillin and to bind them. Sheish b'hem yichud shmo v'yetziat Mitzrayim. Fundamentals of faith. The oneness of Hashem, the yetziat Mitzrayim. Al hazroa keneged halev, al harosh keneged hamoach. On the hand, opposite the heart. On the head, opposite the brain. Kadesh niskol nisim v'niflaot she'asa imanu. To remember all the miracles and the wonders which He performed for us. She'molim al yichudo. This is not just something we do by rote. We should think, well, what are we saying? What's the meaning of it? Talking about the Yichud of Hashem, that He has the power and dominion over the upper worlds, the lower worlds, to do whatever He wants. Your heart and your mind should be subjugated towards Hashem. The moach and the lev. Okay, through all of this, which you think about every morning in 30 seconds, you will remember HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And then he says, Yaniach shayad tchila v'yivarech laniach tefillin. Okay, so put on this to the Shulchan Aruch. He says, you put on the shal yad, and you say the bracha of laniach tefillin, v'achar kach yaniach shal rosh, and then you put on the tefillin shal rosh. What about the bracha? The Shulchan Aruch, lo yivarech, ki em bracha achat l'shtehem. Says, ideally, you only need to say one bracha that goes for all of the mitzvah. Obviously, no interruption, no speech in between one and the other. But that is the Shulchan Aruch, and that is his psak. Says the Rama, v'yesh omrim levalecha shalosh o mitzvah tefillin. Says the Rosh that you should say. There are those who say that you do add in the second bracha on shal Rosh, afilu lo ifsik benatayim, even if you did not interrupt between the two. As we said, if you interrupt between the two, everybody agrees you need to say the second bracha. V'chein pashat ha'minhag b'bnei Ashkenaz. Says the Rama, and this is the minhag in Ashkenaz that we say both brachot. V'tov lomar tamid achar bracha shniya baruch shem kavod malchuto leolam va'ed. And this is a little bit strange, but he says after the second bracha we say the words baruch shem kavod malchuto leolam va'ed. By the way, the Rama, this is what he says. This is the minhag of Bnei Ashkenaz. The Vilna Gaon comes later, even though he was Ashkenazi, he rejects it. The way he learned the sugya, he says only one bracha. So it explains the Mishnah Berurah. Why are we saying Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto Le'olam Va'ed after the second bracha? So it's based on the fact that within the sugya, it's not clear that the second bracha is actually necessary. It says, Mishum chashash safek bracha levatala. We're worried that actually we only need to say one bracha. And there's a safek bracha levatala. And therefore, and the halacha is, if a person said a bracha levatala, obviously you can't do it lekatchila. You're not allowed to say a bracha levatala, but you did for whatever reason. And then the thing to do, it's brought in Siman Resh Vav, is that you say Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto Le'olam Va'ed. You've used Hashem's name in vain. You've diminished from His glory, so to speak, in that way, and therefore you make up for it as much as we can by saying Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto Le'olam Va'ed. Strange over here that you're saying lekatchila, say the bracha and then say the Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto. I just said it doesn't work if you say the bracha in the first place. So he explains that there's lo shu safek gamur. It's not a complete safek over here, because if it was, we wouldn't say it. Im ken ech yivarech misafek bracha levatala v'yismoch Hashem Baruch Shem Kavod achar kach. Ela, but what are we doing? Anan bnei Ashkenaz still ala nalacha kadat Rabbeinu Tam. We paskin the Rama follows the opinion of Rabbeinu Tam, which is that it is required. But because there are other Rishonim all differently, so we add that in. Now, he adds in an important piece of practical halacha, the Mishnah Berurah, says, Yizaher me'od, shelo lomar Baruch Shem rak achar she'adeh kasharosh al rosho k'ra'ui. Says, when do you say Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto? Only after you've put the tefillin shal rosh and you've tightened them and they're in the correct position. He says, if you started putting them on and they hadn't yet finished, so you essentially have not yet put on your tefillin shal rosh, then now you've got a hefsek by saying Baruch Shem, you've created a hefsek, you've spoken between the bracha and based on the tefillin. So what have you done? Then you would need to say the bracha again. Then he says, bracha zo levatala bevadai, v'tzarich lachzor levarech, ve'olam nichshalim bazeh. So Mishnah Berurah, many people stumble with this, get this wrong, and therefore that's why I'm telling you. Just add in one point, the Be'or Halacha says something interesting as well, because everybody's bothered by this. Meaning, if we're paskening that the second bracha is required, you shouldn't need the Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto. If you think that it's a bracha levatala, then you shouldn't say it. That's what the Vilna Gaon says. But somewhere in the middle. So the Be'or Halacha brings Rabbi Akiva Eiger. Rabbi Akiva Eiger has another piece of advice. He says like this. He says, Rabbi Akiva Eiger katav etzah. When you put on the shel yad and you say the first bracha of la'aniach, so he suggests you should have in mind the following: right? He says there's only one bracha that's required. So then so then you have in mind that your bracha now is only applying to the shel yad and not applying to the shel rosh, and that is similar to then you could say the second bracha. Okay, he quotes, the Be'or Halacha quotes that this was brought in earlier sources, the Ola Tamid, the Pri Megadim. He brought this, although he ends off, he says, Einin Hoken, he says we shouldn't do that. But in any event, that was the advice of Rabbi Akiva Eiger to get out of the safek. But bottom line is, this is the, as the Ramah tells us, this is the minhag as it's been established. For Bnei Sfarad, there would only be one bracha. Those who follow the Vilna Gaon as well, it would only be one bracha. For Bnei Ashkenaz who follow the Ramah with the two brachot, we say the Baruch Shem Kavod, because there is still somewhat of a doubt. But since that's the established minhag and that's how we basken, so it's okay to say both brachot. Rabbi Chananya ben Akash Omer, Sakadosh Baruch Hu lezagot Yisrael, Shkach Gebanim Tov Mitzvot Shneimah Le'Echov Tzman Tzidko Yagdir Torah VeYadir.